15th century, Ottoman Turks had a strong presence in Europe. They imposed a military blockade on Eastern Europe, thus forcing Europe's attention westward. Western Europeans used the compass, new sailing technologies, new maps, and advances in astronomy to seek a viable alternative trade route to Asia. They wanted to explore a route which would be uncontested by the Mediterranean powers.
The Portuguese were the first to start the process of historical exploration of Africa first and then Asia. In fact, an historical event, the consequence of that is understood much later. When the event is unfolding, the significance of it most often cannot be gauged. In fact, the Portuguese started the process of the political penetration of Asia and Africa and the New World. It also started the process whereby the whole world became the economic hinterland of Europe. It became a Eurocentric world in the real sense of the term. We also find the penetration of Christianity as a part of the cultural imperialism that was unleashed because of these geographical explorations.
Portugal, with her long shoreline, dotted with harbors and rivers flowing westwards to the Atlantic Ocean, produced generations of adventurous seamen. The Portuguese became the natural leaders of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries.
We find that when these explorations were taking place, the much more important concept of the heliocentric universe was relegated to the background. What was much more important was the discoveries. The discoveries because it provided different opportunities for different sets of people. For Luther, it meant the spread of the gospel in these new areas. We find that during that time, if you look at the history of that period, the Turks were much more important as far as the Europeans were concerned in comparison to the Chinese and the Indians. Now, most often we feel, or it's a kind of an assumption of ours that an important historical event has an important historical cause. But this is not the case with the Portuguese exploration of Africa, because the Portuguese exploration of Africa started with a much more or seemingly unimportant, because of a seemingly unimportant reason. It was a desire colored by the crusading emotion and justified by the missionary zeal to find gold in Africa.
Portugal made significant shipping advances with the introduction of the carracks and caravels. These ships could leave the relatively placid or calm Mediterranean, Baltic, or North Sea and sail safely in the open Atlantic.
The Portuguese descent on the African coast, which began in 1415 with the capture of a place called Ceuta or Ceuta, you can call it anything. And this starts the long struggle of Christianity and Islam and an attempt to reach the sources of an ancient and well-known trade route or trade in gold.
The first great wave of navigation was launched by Portugal under Prince Henry the Navigator. In the earlier era, sailors avoided sailing beyond sight of land for extended periods. A number of nautical myths were prevalent. Sailors were fearful of an oceanic monster or an edge of the world. Prince Henry challenged this belief. The Madeira Islands were discovered in 1419. In 1427, the Azores were found. Henry the Navigator was bent on breaking the Moorish hold on the African and Asian trade routes. When Portugal took the city in northern Morocco, it marked the beginning of European expansion and control of overseas territories. The Europeans focused on searching for gold, charting the overseas route to the spice markets, and converting Muslims and others to Christianity.
Now, the capture of Ceuta, which was a Muslim city at the northern tip of Morocco, was a traditional crusading enterprise. How? We find that Prince Henry, who was the younger son of King John I of Portugal, had come to see it as a step in a coherent program towards African expansion. Hostility to Islam remained a powerful motive behind the Portuguese exploration. And of course, the desire to strike gold. We find that if you look at how gold reached Europe prior to the fact that the Portuguese came to Guinea and from there directly exported the gold or imported the gold into their own country, to Lisbon and later to Antwerp. We do find gold reaching Europe from Africa. A very interesting history whereby we find gold from Guinea. This is powdered gold. It is said that gold was found in the river Niger. It was found along with stones, and these people, the native inhabitants of that area, they collected this gold dust. They took it to the markets of Guinea. From there, they were taken by the Muslim traders to the Saharan areas where, the white Muslim traders from North Africa came. So these two groups merged in the Saharan region. The gold dust was sold by the black, or what was called the Negro. The Negro Muslims to the white Muslims. They then took it to the Mediterranean coast. From the Mediterranean ports of Algiers, Tunis, etc., they went to Venice and Genoa. From Venice and Genoa, they went to the rest of the world.
The source of this gold was believed to be the ancient kingdom of Ghana, the approximate frontiers of which were the river Niger to the east, the river Senegal and its tributary to the south. African trading kingdoms consisted of three main cultures: those of Ghana, Mali and Songhai, all located in West Africa. All three kingdoms maintained vast trading networks across the Sahara Desert and into the Middle East and North Africa.
Now, when the Portuguese descended in Africa, they were trying to find the source of this gold, and then they came to Guinea. Now, when they came to Guinea in the 1460s, we find that the transshipment of gold dust from Guinea to Lisbon was immense. And it was not only one shipload of gold that went to Portugal, but at least 3 or 4 ships which went. So, and in the 1440s, the first gold coins were struck in Portugal. And gold became a very, very important item in the trade of Portugal with Africa. So much so that the ancient gold ports of Maghreb, they lost in importance, and Portugal and Antwerp gained in importance. They became much more prosperous. And the old trade routes through, say, Alexandria, Maghreb, etc., they were relegated to the background. They did not die down. But the major chunk of the trade was now done by the Portuguese merchant, where they directly exported gold to their own country, or rather they directly imported gold into their own country from Africa.
Portugal established monopoly on gold trade, since Portuguese ships brought gold to Lisbon. The golden century of Portugal had begun.
But what is interesting to note about this is that gold did not remain the most important item of export from Africa. It changed to slaves. Now, another very interesting aspect before we go into the slaves is this, that we find of the Cameroon coast, there are certain islands which are actually acquired by the Portuguese. They introduced sugarcane there. Now, the sugar estates are worked by the Negro slaves, and the sugar that is got is exported to Europe. Now, and in return, Europe gives to Africa very colorful clothes and very cheap copper plates, etc., etc. And in return, what do they take? Ivory, ebony, sugar, gold, the expensive items. But we find that this, of course, did not remain, and the importance of gold from Africa waned, because we have gold coming in from Mexico and Peru. But the importance of Africa remained, because Africa now was a center from where slaves were exported to Europe. In fact, the slave trade was much more profitable than the trade in gold. It was during this time that we have Bartholomew Dyers going across the Cape of Good Hope. And eventually, we find that the first European explorer lands in the Indian coast at Calicut. Now, thus starts another aspect of the exploration by Portugal. They, just at what moment Africa did not remain as important in their agenda, we do not really know. At what time Asia grew in importance in comparison to Africa is again something of which we do not have a very clear picture or a very clear idea. Now, what is important to remember is this, that there was this tremendous demand for the Oriental spices. This demand for the Oriental spices was one of the factors which was instrumental in turning the attention of the Portuguese from Africa to the further east, to India, and further east to what is today Indonesia, what eventually came to be known as the East Indies. Now, it's not that it was only after the Portuguese exploration that spice was introduced in Europe. The spice trade between the Orient and the Occident was a very, very ancient trade. Now, you will think that what is so important in spice that, the government of Portugal itself took the initiative to go and find the places where spices are produced. You will see that Europe of the time that we are talking about is a Europe which does not have potato, which does not have corn, which has only seasonal vegetables. Meat is abundant only in autumn when meat is slaughtered. Otherwise, they had to depend on salted meat. So spices were used in sauces to add a kind of a piquancy to sauces. Spices were used to enhance the taste of the food items, and spices were used also to disguise the smell of bad food items. That was the importance of spice. And the spice had been coming into Europe through very ancient trade routes.
On October 10th, 1486, King John II appointed Bartholomew Dias as head of an expedition to sail around the southern end of Africa for the purpose of establishing a sea route to the rich trading grounds of India. Dias reached the southernmost tip of Africa and was forced by the crew's fears to turn around and head back to Portugal. The southernmost tip of Africa was named Cape of Good Hope. Emmanuel of Portugal later appointed Vasco da Gama as the commander of the next major expedition to find an ocean route to the East Indies. He set sails from Lisbon in July 1497. After turning round the Cape of Good Hope and reaching the eastern coast of Africa, his fleet crossed the Indian Ocean in 23 days. They were guided by the Indian pilot Ibn Majid. Vasco da Gama's fleet arrived in Calicut on 20th May 1498. India's Malabar Coast was at the center of the spice trade. It was the main outlet for Kerala's large pepper crop. Merchants from the Indonesian Spice Islands also came here to trade cloves with Arab merchants from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. The Muslim traders had considerable influence on the Hindu king Jamorin of Calicut. They were unwilling to relinquish the control over spice trade to the Christian visitors.
Most of the Indian Ocean spice trade was controlled by the Muslim traders. What do we find? Malacca. Malacca was an important center of spice. The East Indian spice came to Malacca. From that, it was carried by the Muslim merchants to Calicut. Calicut was an important place of transshipment, re-export. From here, there were two routes. One,
Beirut.
yes, via Beirut, the other via Aden. Now, and from there, of course, we find it goes to the Venetian and the Genoese ports, and from there it's re-exported to the rest of Europe. But the thing is, the price of the spices was exorbitant. It could not be used by the common people. Because you see, the way it goes, the mode of transport made the item a very expensive item. The Portuguese wanted to capture this spice trade and bring spice directly to Lisbon and Antwerp. What happened was this, that they first fought a war, and thereby they captured that trade route which Aden could not be captured. But that trade route which led to Beirut, that trade route was captured. They defeated the Turks there, and thereby we find that directly from India they took the spices to Lisbon and Antwerp. And in fact, a time came when even the Venetian merchants would have to go to Lisbon and Antwerp to buy spices.
Vasco da Gama's ships went back to Portugal laden with spices. sailing against the current, the fleet took nearly 3 months to reach Portugal, resulting in severe illness and deaths of several sailors. Vasco da Gama made a few more trips to India and eventually died in Cochin in 1524. During one of his trips, his men captured Goa in 1510. The capture of Goa not only gave Portugal a much greater control over trade in the Indian Ocean, but also paved the way to making her a world power.
Now, but what is important to remember as far as the geographical explorations of Portugal is concerned is this, that they could not exert a monopoly over the spice trade. They broke the monopoly of the Muslims over the spice trade, but themselves could not assert the monopoly of the spice trade. But what is important to remember is this, that first gold, then slaves, and then eventually spices. These were the factors which induced the geographical explorations. Nothing very serious, as I had said when I started the discussion, that important historical events are always not guided by important historical causes. So the cause of the exploration was something which was, if you look at it, something which was not very important. But the result of these explorations, or the result of the desire to find the sources of these materials, led to a situation whereby we find a process is initiated by an European power, which will result in the other European powers following suit, starting with the Spanish, the Dutch, then comes the French, the English, and eventually making the world into the economic hinterland of Europe, and also a place where the political might of Europe would be exerted.
ম্যাম এই আফ্রিকাতে যে সোনাগুলো যাচ্ছে মানে পর্তুগালে বা ইউরোপে, তার ফলে কি এই সময় ইউরোপে প্রাইস রেভলিউশন হয়েছিল?
Exactly. This is a very well-known fact. This is another aspect altogether, but this is a very well-known fact. Because of this huge amassing of gold, not only from Africa, but later from Peru and Mexico also.
Ma'am, did the discoveries in the 15th century brought about any change in the character of the crusading movement against Islam?
The crusading movement, it started as a religious movement, but the thing is, the crusades also opened other avenues. And as you see that whether it is the gold trade in Africa or it is the spice trade in the Indian Ocean region, these were all, you have a monopoly of the Muslims over them. So this is a continuation of the crusading process, whereby the Christian world is trying to exert its predominance over the Muslim world. And because of this, we find that the Muslim preeminence of trade in Africa and Asia was now, was waning because of the, you find the Christianity encroaching into these predominantly Muslim avenues, and they were trying to wrest from the Muslim world that which had made the Muslim world so prosperous.